There will be times when creating float-based layouts that you want the floated elements to no longer affect the elements that follow them. In our own layout, for example, the main content region and the sidebar are using floats to achieve a two-column layout. We don't want or even need the footer to be overlapped by our floated elements. Towards that end, we'll apply a clear to our layout. Clearing floats is an essential technique for achieving reliable float-based layouts. It's your way of saying, that's it. Those floated elements shouldn't float any element past this point. The clear CSS property has three possible values: left, right, and both. By clearing to the left or to the right, you're essentially saying that nothing can float to the left or right of the cleared element. A clear value of both says that no element may float the cleared element, whether it's to the right or to the left. Once floats are cleared, normal document flow continues, and cleared elements will continue to push down in response to the elements above them, even floated elements. In this sample layout, we're going to clear the footer element, which will move it down below our floated elements into the desired location. So let's take a moment to review our page structure. And here I have the clearing.html file open. So we have a wrapper div tag, which wraps all the other content on the page. We're using auto margins so that the wrapper is centered on the page regardless of the size. Now inside the wrapper div tag, we have a div with an ID of header. It's followed with a div with an ID of main content. Further down the page, we have a div with an ID of sidebar. And then finally, we have a div with an ID of footer. Now, as you can tell, we have some very basic CSS properties set here. We have some height set, we have background colors, we have some text colors, but other than that, we really aren't doing anything with the layout. So I'm going to scroll back up to the top, and we're going to start our layout by floating the main content. Now, in this case, we want the main content to be on the right-hand side, and we want the sidebar to be on the left-hand side. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we can do this. As a matter of fact, if you look at two float-based layouts that are exactly the same, chances are their CSS might be significantly different. So there are a lot of different techniques for doing what we're about to do here. I'm going to select the pound main content selector over here in the CSS styles panel, and I want to add a property to that. I'm going to go ahead and add the float property, and I'm going to float that to the right. That's going to float the main content over to the right-hand side, and you can see the sidebar moves up to occupy the space that the main content used to be in. Now, one thing that you're really not seeing here is that if the main content's background color was transparent, you would actually see that sort of light periwinkle, I guess, sidebar color go up underneath the main content. So there's actually overlap going on here now. Now, one thing I neglected to mention earlier is that our wrapper div tag is 800 pixels wide. So now, when we put our main content on the right-hand side and our sidebar on the left-hand side, one of the things that we want to do is set a width for those that is going to calculate out to that 800 pixels wide of our wrapper. That way we know exactly how much area we have in the main content and the sidebar for any content that we may place in there later. So I'm going to go back to our main content, and I'm going to add a property to this, and I'm going to add the width property. And in this case, I'm going to make it 500 pixels wide. So that extends the main content out a little bit, and now we see the sidebar on the left-hand side, the main content on the right-hand side. Now, I'd like to point out one more thing, too. If you're going to use floating for layouts, whenever you float an element, a best practice is to establish a width for that element as well. That's going to prevent a number of problems in certain browsers. All right, next I want to go down to my sidebar. I'm going to select my sidebar, and I'm going to click to add a property here. I'm going to add the float property, and this time, instead of floating to the right, I'm going to float the sidebar to the left. It moves it over to the left-hand side of the page, and now the sidebar is on the left, all the way up against the edge of its parent element, which in this case is the wrapper. The main content is floated to the right, all the way up against its parent element edge, which in this case is the wrapper. Now, the sidebar is a lot narrower than the main content, but we still need to increase its width a little bit just so we don't have this big gap in the middle of them as we have here. Now, you might be wondering, hey, when is he going to say something about that footer? Yeah, that footer does not look right at all. Let's finish off our sidebar, and we'll talk about what's going on with that footer. So I'm going to add a property here, and I want to go ahead and add a width value, and I'm going to give it 280 pixels worth of width. those values were arrived at in thinking about what I wanted for this particular layout. We have 800 pixels worth of space from side to side here. By giving 500 pixels here and 280 pixels here, we're left with a total of 20 pixels. That 20 pixels becomes the gutter between the sidebar and the main content region. So in this case, there's no need for us to worry about padding or margins to try to keep those two elements away from each other. The width is going to do it for us. Now, back to that poor footer. Okay, so now it's even worse because the footer doesn't have any room to show up. When we scroll down, the text of the footer is actually down here. You can't see it because it's white and it's on the white background of the wrapper div tag. However, the sort of brown background color of the footer is readily apparent. So what happens? Well, the footer is going to move up because two elements above it are floated. So it moves up to occupy the space that those elements used to occupy in the normal document flow. So our normal document flow now just says header and footer. It doesn't say header, main content, sidebar, footer because main content and sidebar are floated and thus removed from the normal document flow. So in order to get our footer to locate in the right place, that would be at the very bottom of the layout down here, we need to reestablish that normal document flow. And the way to do that is by using clearing. So I'm going to go to my footer selector over here in CSS Styles. I'm going to add a property to that, and I'm going to add a clear property. Now, if I grab the pull-down menu for clear, I can see that I have left, right, and both. Now, the main content is floated to the right, and the sidebar is floated to the left. So I really can't choose one over the other. I need to go ahead, in this case, choose both. So I'm going to choose both, and hey, look what happens. Our footer reappears at the bottom of the page because now we have reestablished normal document flow. The footer is no longer allowing any element to float to its left, and it's no longer allowing any element to float to its right. Because of that, normal document flow is reestablished. So essentially what happens is the header is in normal document flow. Main content and sidebar temporarily interrupt that as one floats to the right and one floats to the left. But then the footer reestablishes normal document flow by clearing the floats and saying, no, I'm not going to be affected by either of those two guys above me. Now, the really nice thing about this particular technique is that if the height of the main content region or the height of the sidebar increases, the footer is going to continue to push down the page because it will never allow one of the two of them to float. So, for example, if I go to main content and I make its height, say 600 pixels, if we scroll down, we can see that the main content is pushing the footer down. This is exactly what we need for a two-column layout that has a header and a footer. So by clearing floats, we can reestablish normal document flow, contain floats, and help our layout take shape. If you become familiar with these techniques, you'll understand how the overwhelming majority of CSS-based layouts are created. Now keep in mind, this is a very simple, very basic layout, but also an amazingly common one. A header, two columns of content, and a footer has become a standard for many types of web pages. Using floats and clearing them when necessary is a quick and easy way to achieve most of your layout requirements. Of course, we've just scratched the surface of what you need to know when floating elements. For more information on floats and clearing and containing those floats, please consult the other CSS titles in the lynda.com online training library. I cover floats and controlling them in much more detail in my Dreamweaver CSS Essential titles. Now that we've discussed floats, we're going to discuss using the CSS position property to tweak our layouts and increase the control we have over individual elements within our pages.